Church History in Plain Language, 5th edition, by Bruce L. Shelley. Chapter 19. The Search for Unity. Charlemagne and Christendom. The date was April 25th, 799, St. Mark's Day, the customary day of repentance and prayer. This year, however, the faithful had been plagued by accidents and severe crop damage. So Pope Leo III, 795 to 819, was leading a procession through Rome for God's blessing upon the fields and their harvest. The procession led from the Church of the Lateran through the middle of the city to St. Peter's. As it turned the corner by the monastery of Saints Stephen and Sylvester, armed men rushed at the Pope. They drove off his attendants and pulled Leo off his horse and whisked him away to a Greek monastery. It was a mutiny led by ranking officials and dignitaries loyal to the previous Pope, Adrian I. Perjury and adultery were among the charges leveled at Leo. Using the cover of darkness, the Pope's supporters were able to rescue him and to bring him back to St. Peter's. But continued fighting in the streets convinced Leo that he needed outside help. His appeal went to the traditional protector of the papacy, the King of the Franks, Charles the Great. The next year, Charles crossed the Alps with an army prepared to settle the Pope's problem once and for all. In December, the king presided over a large assembly of bishops, nobles, diplomats, members of the royal household, and rebels. On December 23rd, the Pope, holding the gospel in his ringed hand, took an oath purging himself of the accusations against him. With that, the mutiny waned, but the stage was set for a more important development. On Christmas Day, Charles came to St. Peter's with a large retinue for Christmas worship. Leo sang the Mass and Charles prayed on his knees in front of the crypt of the Apostle. Charles saw the Pope approach. In his hands was a golden crown. Leo placed it on Charles' head as the congregation cried, "To Charles, the most pious, crowned Augustus by God, to the great peacemaking emperor, long life and victory." The Pope prostrated himself. Charles the Great, King of the Franks, had restored the Christian Roman Empire. Modern times are marked by the idea of autonomous, sovereign states without religious affiliation, by the concept of the Church as a voluntary association apart from the rest of organized society. But neither of these ideas existed in the Middle Ages. Drawing on Augustine's vision of the city of God, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, engrafted the Christian concept of a universal Catholic Church on the stock of the traditional Roman view of empire and gave to the medieval world Christendom, a unified society mingling religious or eternal concerns with earthly or temporal affairs. How did it happen? How could the kingdom that Jesus said was not of the world become so much a part of worldly power? The answer lies in the persistence of an idea and the rise of a powerful kingdom. Ideas die slowly. Centuries after its fall to barbarism, the Roman Empire in the West continued its sway over the imaginations of leaders and followers alike. The barbarians had many kingdoms and were often at war with one another, but many still longed for the unity that had once marked the empire, and they looked for the day when a new Roman Empire would appear. As the Greeks believed that Rome had passed over to Constantinople, so the Roman people and their German neighbors thought that the empire would live again among them. In the blending of Roman and Germanic peoples and cultures, the Franks ascended above the others and seemed destined to restore the imperial authority. Clovis, with the support of the Catholic Church, had made the kingdom of the Franks a dominant power among the German tribes. After the death of Clovis, however, his destiny began to decay from inner weakness. The Germanic practice of treating the kingdom as personal property and dividing it among the king's sons resulted in constant and bitter civil war. So the royal heirs plotted murders and became adept at intrigue and treachery. At the same time, a new center of power arose from the landed aristocrats. More and more authority shifted into their hands. Among these powerful landowners, one emerged as the most influential figure in the kingdom. He was called Mayor of the Palace. A new day dawned for the kingdom of the Franks in 714, when Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, became mayor of the palace. Martel allowed the Merovingian kings to retain their claim to the throne, but they were mere figureheads. The real power rested with the mayor of the palace. Many students remember Charles for his victory over the Muslim invaders of Europe. This triumph earned him the surname Martel, the Hammer. In 711, a Muslim army from North Africa had invaded Spain, and by 718, the weak kingdom of the Visigoths had collapsed, with most of the Iberian Peninsula under their control. The Muslims began making raids across the Pyrenees Mountains. In 732, Charles Martel met them near Tours, deep within the Frankish kingdom. He inflicted heavy losses on them, so during the night they retreated toward Spain and were never again a major threat to Central Europe. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, 741-68, was a worthy successor to his father. He thought the time had come, however, to legalize the regal power exercised by the mayors of the palace. He turned to the Pope for a ruling stipulation that whoever had the actual power should be the legal ruler. He got what he wanted. With the papal blessing, Boniface, the great English missionary among the Germans, in 751 crowned Pepin king of the Franks. The last Merovingian was quietly shelved in a secluded monastery. 3 years later, the Pope blessed this coup d'etat by crossing the Alps and personally anointing Pepin, in the Old Testament manner, as the chosen of the Lord. As one historian explains it, behind the Pope's action lay his need for a powerful protector. In 751, the Lombards had conquered the imperial territory at Ravenna, the seat of Byzantine government in Italy, and were demanding tribute from the Pope and threatening to take Rome. Following Pepin's coronation, the Pope secured his promise of armed intervention in Italy and his pledge to give the papacy the territory of Ravenna once it was conquered. In 756, a Frankish army forced the Lombard king to surrender his conquests, and Pepin officially conferred the Ravenna territory upon the Pope. Known as the Donation of Pepin, the gift made the Pope a temporal ruler over the Papal States, a strip of territory that extended diagonally across Italy from coast to coast. Peter recovered his sword. This alliance between the Franks and the papacy affected the course of European politics and Christianity for centuries. It accelerated the separation of the Latin Church from the Greek by providing the papacy with a dependable Western ally in place of the Byzantines. Hitherto its only protector against the Lombards, it created the Papal States, which played a major role in Italian politics till the late 19th century, and by the ritual anointing it provided Western kingship with a religious sanction that would in time contribute to the rivalry between Pope and Emperor. Only one significant step remained to restore the Christian Empire in the West. That came with the rise of power of Pepin's illustrious son, Charles. Today we know him as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. When Charles succeeded his father in 768, his mind was set on three goals: military power to crush his enemies, religious power to direct his people's souls, and intellectual power to instruct both souls and minds. Charlemagne's success in these areas made Europe the new political order, nominally Christian, for better or for worse, for 1,000 years. Architect of an empire. Einhard, in his famous biography of Charlemagne, pictured his king as a natural leader, tall, physically strong, and a great horseman, who was always in the van of the hunt. Although he was preeminently a successful warrior king, leading his armies on yearly campaigns, Charlemagne also sought to provide an effective administration for his realm. 4 areas were successfully annexed to the kingdom by military might. First was his southern border. Taking advantage of feuds among the Muslims in Spain, Charlemagne sought to extend Christendom into that land. In 778, he crossed the Pyrenees with only minor success. On later expeditions, however, he drove the Muslims back to the Ebro River and established a frontier area known as the Spanish March, centered around Barcelona. Second, Charlemagne conquered the Bavarians and the Saxons, the last of the independent Germanic tribes. It took 32 campaigns to subdue the staunchly pagan Saxons, who lived between the Rhine and Elbe rivers. Charlemagne divided Saxony into bishoprics, built monasteries, and proclaimed harsh laws against paganism. Eating meat during Lent, cremating the dead, an old pagan practice, and pretending to be baptized were offenses punishable by death. His brutality in conquering and converting the Saxons was extreme by any measure. A third trouble spot was the kingdom's eastern frontier, which was continually threatened by the Slavs and the Avars, Asiatic nomads related to the Huns. In 6 campaigns, Charlemagne decimated the Avars and then set up his own military province in the valley of the Danube to guard against any possible future plundering by eastern nomads. Called the East Mark, this territory later became Austria. Finally, like his father before him, Charlemagne intervened in Italian politics. Expansionist ambition drove the Lombard king to invade again the papal territories. At the behest of the Pope, Charlemagne defended the Lombards in 774 and proclaimed himself their king. While in Italy, he cemented his father's alliance with the Church of Rome by confirming the donation of Pepin. That first incursion into Italy proved to be the prelude to the one in 800 that resulted in his coronation as emperor. The Pope needed protection. Charlemagne needed divine sanction. After his Christmas coronation, Charlemagne said that he did not know it had been planned, but he lived up to it. He wrote in his dispatches, "Charles, by the will of God, Roman Emperor Augustus, the year of our consulship, the first." He had an oath taken to him as Caesar by all officers, lay or ecclesiastical. He sent ambassadors to soothe the anger of the emperor in Constantinople, and in 812 the Eastern Court acknowledged him. The ceremony in St. Peter's demonstrated that the memory of the Roman Empire survived as a vital tradition in Europe, and that there was a strong desire to reestablish political unity. The coronation also inaugurated, however, a long-standing struggle between the revived empire and the papacy. In medieval theory, church and state were but 2 aspects of Christendom. The one represented Christian society organized to secure spiritual blessings, the other the same society united to safeguard justice and human welfare. Theoretically, the church and state were in harmonious interplay, each aiming to secure the good of humankind. In fact, however, The Pope and Emperor were contestants. The ever-present question was, should the Church rule the state or the state control the Church? This contest was illustrated on countless fields, large and small, throughout the Middle Ages. Since time depended upon eternity, the papal party held that the emperor depended on the pope. But since Constantine and Charlemagne revealed that God also ordained the Christian state, the imperial party argued that the emperor was independent of the pope, and if the Holy Father neglected his eternal office in time, the emperor might even correct or control the pope. In his lifetime, Charlemagne left no doubts about sovereignty in his empire. He gave Europe a dominating father figure. Everyone within the realm was answerable to him. To solve the problem of supervising local officials, a concern that plagued all German rulers, Charlemagne issued an ordinance creating the Missi Dominati, the king's envoys. Pairs of these itinerant officials, usually a bishop and a lay noble, traveled throughout the realm to check on the local administration. Even the Pope could not hide from Charles's watchful eyes. Charlemagne also fostered a revival of learning and the arts. His efforts have prompted historians to speak of this period as a cultural rebirth. In 789, Charlemagne decreed that every monastery must have a school for the education of boys in singing, arithmetic, and grammar. At Aix-la-Chapelle, his capital, the emperor sponsored a palace school for the education of the royal household and the stimulation of learning throughout the realm. His importation of scholars from Italy and Ireland promoted studies in Greek and Latin. Alcuin, an Anglo-Saxon scholar in charge of the school, began the arduous task of reviving learning by undertaking the first step of writing textbooks in grammar, spelling, rhetoric, and logic. Alcuin exhorted his students, "Ye lads whose age is fitted for reading, learn. The years go by like running water. Waste not the teachable days in idleness." Few historians challenge Charlemagne's claim to greatness as a major constructive figure of world history. From the new center in the north, rather than on the Mediterranean, he extended Christian civilization in Europe. After 3 centuries of disorder, he restored a measure of law and order. His patronage of learning left a cultural heritage that later generations could build on. And the imperial ideal that he revived persisted as a political force in Europe until 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire was terminated by another self-styled emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. The decline into feudalism. Unfortunately, Charlemagne's empire afforded no more than a breathing space. Its territories were too vast and its nobility too powerful to be held together under existing conditions after the dominating personality of its creator had passed from the scene. Under his weak successors, the empire disintegrated amid the confusion of civil wars and devastating new invasions. When Vikings began sweeping out of the Northland, people increasingly surrendered both their lands and their persons to the many counts, dukes, and other local lords in return for protection. These disintegrating conditions presented a new challenge to the Church and to the unity of Europe. We call it feudalism. Feudalism was a type of government in which political power was exercised locally by private individuals rather than by the agents of a centralized state. One popular text explains it this way: fully developed feudalism was a fusion of 3 basic elements. 1. The personal element, called lordship or vassalage, by which one nobleman, the vassal, became the loyal follower of a stronger nobleman, the lord, or suzerain. 2. The property element, called the fief, usually land, which the vassal received from his lord to enable him to fulfill the obligations of vassalage. And 3. The governmental element, meaning the private exercise of governmental functions over vassals and fiefs. The roots of these 3 elements ran back to late Roman and early Germanic times. Central to feudalism was the personal bond between lord and vassal. In the ceremony known as the Act of Homage, the vassal knelt before his lord and promised fealty. With this oath, the vassal swore on the Bible or some other sacred object that he would remain true to his lord. Next, in the ritual of investiture, a lance, a glove, or even a bit of straw was handed the vassal to signify his jurisdiction, not ownership, over the fief. By the end of the 11th century, the ceremony included the vassal kneeling before the feudal lord. The vassal would join his hands and extend them. The feudal lord would clasp his hands around the vassal's hands, pull him up, and kiss him. The vassal's hands, joined and extended, have become the symbol and posture of prayer today, praying hands. The feudal contract thus entered into by lord and vassal was considered sacred and binding on both parties. Breaking this tie of mutual obligations was considered a felony because it was the fundamental bond of early medieval society. The lord, for his part, was obliged to give his vassal protection and justice. The vassal's primary duty was military service. He was expected to devote 40 days' service each year to the lord without pay. Since the church was so much a part of medieval life, it could not escape inclusion in the feudal system. The unsettled conditions caused by new invaders, Vikings from the north and Magyars from Asia, forced church officials to enter into close relations with the only power able to offer them protection, the feudal barons in France and the kings in Germany. Bishops and abbots thus became vassals, receiving fiefs for which they were obligated to provide the usual feudal services. This loyalty to higher lords created unusual conflicts for those bishops who looked to the Pope as God's appointed shepherd of the Church. In the 10th and early 11th centuries, the Pope was in no position to challenge anyone. The office fell into decay after becoming a prize sought by local Roman nobles. On the positive side, however, the Church sought to influence for the better the behavior of the feudal barons. In addition to attempting to add Christian virtues to the code of knightly conduct called chivalry, the Church tried to impose limitations on feudal warfare. In the 11th century, bishops inaugurated the Peace of God and Truce of God movements. The Peace of God banned from the sacraments all persons who pillaged sacred places or refused to spare non-combatants. The Truce of God established closed seasons on fighting, from sunset on Wednesday to sunrise on Monday, and certain longer periods such as Lent. Unfortunately, both movements were generally ineffective. Only after the German king Otto the Great revived the Roman Empire in the West in 962 was some sense of unity restored. With the renewal of the empire, however, came the old rivalry between church and state. Otto claimed to be the successor of Augustus, Constantine, and Charlemagne, although his actual power was confined to Germany and Italy. At first, the papacy looked to the German king for protection against the unruly Italian nobles, who for a century had been making a prize of the papacy. From the church's viewpoint, however, this arrangement had its drawbacks, for the German kings continued to interfere in ecclesiastical affairs, even in the election of popes. During the 11th century, the controversy between church and state centered on the problem of lay investiture. Theoretically, on assuming office, a bishop or abbot was subject to two investitures. His spiritual authority was bestowed by a church official, and his feudal or civil authority by the king or a noble. In fact, however, feudal lords and kings came to control both the appointment and the installation of churchmen. This practice was most pronounced in Germany, where control of the church was the foundation of the king's power. The German church was in essence a state church, setting in order the house of God. The church was ill-prepared to challenge kings and emperors. It needed to set its own house in spiritual order. This began with a far-reaching revival within the Reformed Benedictine Order of Cluny, founded in 910. From the original monastery in Burgundy, a powerful impulse radiated from the reform of the feudalized church. The Cluniac program began as a movement for monastic reform, but in time it called for the enforcement of clerical celibacy and the abolition of simony. The purchase or sale of a church office. The term simony comes from Simon the magician, who tried to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit from the apostles, Acts 8:9-25. The ultimate goal of the Cluniac reformers was to free the entire church from secular control and subject it to papal authority. Some 300 Cluniac houses were freed from lay control, and in 1059 the papacy itself was removed from secular interference by the creation of the College of Cardinals, which henceforth elected the popes. The man behind the reform of the papacy was an archdeacon named Hildebrand. In 1073, he was elected pope, and as Gregory VII, 1073-85, he claimed unprecedented power for the papacy. Gregory held as his ideal the creation of the Christian commonwealth under papal control. Instead of conceding equality between the church and the state, he insisted that the spiritual power was supreme over the temporal. In 1075, he formally prohibited lay investiture and threatened to excommunicate any layman who performed it and any churchman who submitted to it. This drastic act virtually declared war against Europe's rulers, since most of them practiced lay investiture. The climax of the struggle occurred in Gregory's clash with Emperor Henry IV. The Pope accused Henry of simony and lay investiture and appointing his own choice to be the Archbishop of Milan. Gregory summoned Henry to Rome to explain his conduct. Henry's answer was to convene in 1076 a synod of German bishops that declared Gregory a usurper and unfit to occupy the Roman see. Quote, "Henceforth we renounce, now and for the future, all obedience unto thee." Unquote. In retaliation, Gregory excommunicated Henry and deposed him, absolving his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. At last, driven to make peace with the Holy Father by a revolt against the German nobles, Henry appeared before Gregory in January 1077 at Canossa, a castle in the mountains of Italy. Dressed as a penitent, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days and begged forgiveness until, in Gregory's words, quote, "we loosed the chain of the anathema and at length received him into the lap of the Holy Mother Church." End quote. This dramatic humiliation of the emperor, says one historian, did not resolve the quarrel, nor do contemporary accounts attach much significance to the incident. Public penance was not uncommon in those days, even for kings. Yet the Pope had made progress toward freeing the Church from interference by lay people and toward increasing the power and prestige of the papacy. The problem of lay investiture was settled in 1122 by the compromise known as the Concordat of Worms. The Church maintained the right to elect the holder of an ecclesiastical office, but only in the presence of the emperor or his representative. Later popes added little to Gregory's theories of the office. They, like Gregory, insisted that Christian society was organized under the Pope, its visible head, and he was guarded against all possibility of error by the presence of Peter perpetually present in his successors. The bishops of Rome, many of Gregory's claims now appear intolerable, Yet we must agree that Gregory and his powerful successors stood for two principles that to the Christian are incontestable. One, in the loyalties of women and men, the spiritual has primacy over the secular, and two, the families of men and women can find true unity only in Christ and in obedience to the law of God. Medieval society was far from perfect, but during the Middle Ages, Europe became conscious of itself as a unity, far beyond the uncertain limits of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Church attained a level of power and influence over people's lives, for the most part used helpfully, such as it has never known since that time. Chapter 20. The Papacy and the Crusader, lifted in a mystic manner. In Paris, on a small island in the Seine, stands an edifice of weather-beaten stone, the Gothic Cathedral of Notre Dame, dedicated to the glory of God and the veneration of Our Lady. This well-known sanctuary reflects a fascinating image of the life and spirit of the Christian Middle Ages. Notre Dame was erected between 1163 and 1235, during some of the most epoch-making years of Western Christianity. While workers were constructing a flying buttress or carefully fitted a beautiful window in place, students reclined on the Petit Point, a bridge that led to the left bank, and exchanged reports of Crusader victories in the Holy Land, or wrangled over one of the theological virtues. Some of these students would shortly wear the colors of the episcopal office, and one of them would carry the papal office to the zenith of worldly power as Pope Innocent III. Notre Dame was only one symptom of a veritable fever of church building then infecting Europe. Between 1170 and 1270, more than 500 great churches were built in Gothic style in France alone. Gothic first appeared in the restoration of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis near Paris. The abbot of Saint Denis, Suger, conceived the project and guided the work of rebuilding between 1137 and 1144. He described his reaction to the restoration in terms seldom surpassed in praise of the Gothic. I seemed to find myself, as it were, in some strange part of the universe, which was neither wholly of the baseness of the earth, nor wholly of the serenity of heaven. But by the grace of God, I seemed lifted in a mystic manner from this lower towards the upper sphere. Lift, reach, aspiration. These are the terms for the age. The Middle Ages were not all dark, as the hundreds of Gothic cathedrals so readily testify. What can Christians hope for in human society? If God's will were done on earth as it is in heaven, what would earth look like? Believers in every age have asked that question, but no age has reached for the stars quite like the so-called High Middle Ages. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy led an admirable attempt to develop a perfect society on earth. The Church achieved an incomparable power and majesty. Like the Gothic cathedral, the medieval Church shot upward into the heavens, calling all below it to the glory of God. But like the cathedrals, the papacy reached for the impossible and first cracked, then in time crumbled. It happened often with the church buildings. Early Gothic builders tried to attain the utmost height possible with the materials at hand. The Cathedral of Chartres, for example, equals the elevation of a 30-story skyscraper. The Strasbourg Cathedral rises 40 stories. Many such efforts resulted in repeated failures in church construction. One historian of cathedrals has remarked that the question to put to a tourist guide is, when did the tower fall down? By reaching the greatest height possible, the architect tried to create the illusion of soaring. The use of flying buttresses eliminated the massive walls of earlier churches and made possible slender pillars that, in turn, were carved in the form of a cluster of still more slender shafts reaching up into infinity. Even the sculptured forms of saints or angels standing in the niches were elongated. The necks, the arms, the legs seemed to be soaring heavenward. What is probably the best way to understand Western Christianity in the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy ascended high above European society, mounting upon the fading glory of the empire. The emergence of unified national states reduced the empire to a shadow of its former universal power. Emperors continued to call themselves ever august Roman empires, and continued to go to Rome for their coronations, and they were actually merely the sovereigns of the cluster of kingdoms and municipal republics that constituted the Germany of the late Middle Ages. The papacy, by contrast, built on the reforms of Pope Gregory VII and emerged as the most powerful office in Europe. The Pope's government was a truly universal monarchy, steadily becoming completely centralized. All the bishops swore fealty to the Pope. No religious order could be founded without his authorization. The papal court in Rome heard appeals from all over Christendom, and in every country, legates from Rome watched over the execution of papal orders. In the hands of a strong leader, the papacy could overshadow all secular monarchs. Such a leader was Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, a new type of administrator pope. Unlike Gregory VII and other earlier reformed popes who were monks, Innocent and other great popes of the later 12th and 13th centuries were trained as canon lawyers, experts in church government. Innocent was like Gregory VII, however, in holding an exalted view of his office. The successor of Peter, he announced, is the vicar of Christ. He has been established as a mediator between God and man, below God but beyond man, less than God but more than man. He who shall judge all and be judged by no one. Innocent III told the princes of Europe that the papacy was like the sun, while kings were like the moon. As the moon received its light from the sun, so kings derived their powers from the Pope. The papacy's chief weapons in support of this authority were spiritual penalties. Almost everyone believed in heaven and hell, and in the Pope's management of the grace to get to one and avoid the other. Thus, the Pope's first weapon in bringing peasants and princes to their knees was the threat of excommunication. He could pronounce their anathema, and they would be set apart from the church, deprived of the grace essential for salvation. After some bishop read the solemn of the grace essential for After some bishop read the solemn sentence of excommunication, a bell rang as for a funeral. A book was closed, and a candle was extinguished, all to symbolize the cutting off of the guilty man. If he entered a church during Mass, he was expelled or the Mass was halted. While under excommunication, persons could not act as judge, juror, witness, or attorney. They could not be guardians, executors, or parties to contract. After death, they received no Christian burial, and if, by chance, they were buried in consecrated ground, the church had their bodies disinterred and destroyed. The second weapon in the papal arsenal was the interdict. While excommunication was aimed at individuals, the interdict fell upon whole nations. It suspended all public worship and, with the exception of baptism and extreme unction, to withdraw the sacraments from the lands of disobedient rulers. Pope Innocent III successfully applied or threatened the interdict 85 times against uncooperative princes. So successful was the pontiff in asserting his temporal as well as spiritual supremacy that many states, both large and small, formally acknowledged the Pope as their feudal lord. In England, King John differed with Innocent over the election of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Innocent placed England under interdict and excommunicated John. Under attack from his barons, John capitulated to Innocent by becoming his vassal, receiving England back as a fief, and paying him a sizable annual tribute. In France, Innocent forced King Philip Augustus to comply with the Church's moral code by taking back as his queen the woman he had divorced with the consent of the French bishops. And within the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, Innocent intervened in a civil war between rival candidates for the throne. Supporting first one, then the other, in the end, Innocent secured the election of his ward. The young Hohenstaufen heir Frederick II, who promised to respect papal rights and to go on a crusade. Wielding these spiritual weapons, Innocent and his successors in the papal office during the 13th century led Christianity to its peak of political and cultural influence. We simply cannot understand the Pope's place in our own times without some understanding of these years. The soaring dreams, the delusions of the papacy in this period appear preeminently in the Crusades and in scholasticism. And in one, the Pope claimed power over the holy cause in history, in the other, he maintained authority over the souls of men and women even in eternity. We will look at the Crusades in this chapter and examine scholasticism in the next, taking up the cross for Christ. The Crusades reflected the new dynamism in Western Christianity. Islam had come to birth through the visions and revelations claimed by its prophet Muhammad, who was born in AD 570. At the age of 25, he suddenly moved from being a keeper of camels to overseeing the business affairs of a wealthy widow. She was impressed by his character and, though 15 years his senior, soon married him. Although after she died he took numerous wives, while she was alive she remained his only wife. At the age of 40, Muhammad began to retire into a cave for extended periods of contemplation and meditation. After one of these occasions, he told his wife that he had been visited by an angel, who ordered him to recite, and from that command came the Quran, which literally means to recite. At first he was perplexed by it all, but his wife told him that could well be the call of God upon him. She became his first follower, and then a handful of family members followed suit. Many resisted his claim to be God's spokesman, and it was only after various battles, arguments, and wars that Muhammad was able to gain a vast following in Arabia. In the first 100 years of this Arabic movement, numerous capitals such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo fell to Islam. But the succession of Muhammad after his unexpected death in AD 632 became a serious divisive issue. He had not named a successor, and an immediate struggle for the leadership of the movement ensued. One group, the Sunnis, insisted that the first caliph should be elected. Shiites argued that the successor must come from Muhammad's own bloodline, which would have been Ali, his cousin and son-in-law. Now in the age of the Grand Cathedral, Crusaders from Western Europe attempted to expel the Muslims from the Holy Land. Historians have attributed numerous motives to the Crusades: religious fervor, love of adventure, and dreams of personal profit. While few contemporary Christians would defend the idea of the Crusades or their grossest offenses, we must not overlook a simple reality. Christians sought to counter Islam's remarkable military conquest and keep their geographic strongholds from being overrun. By the 8th century, one half of all Christians lived under Islamic rule. All the great and colorful figures of this era were caught up in this consuming cause, from Peter the Hermit, who inflamed the First Crusade, to the saintly Louis IV, King of France, who inspired the Sixth and Seventh. For centuries, peaceful pilgrims had been traveling from Europe to worship at the birthplace of Christ. The rise and spread of Islam in the Near East during the 7th century did not interrupt this traffic. By the 10th century, bishops were organizing mass pilgrimages to the Holy Land, the largest, which set out from Germany and 1065 included about 7,000 pilgrims. During the 11th century, however, Christian pilgrims began to encounter persecution, and when the Seljuk Turks, new and fanatical converts to Islam, came sweeping and plundering into the Near East, the situation became especially tense. The Seljuks seized Jerusalem from their fellow Muslims and then swept north into Asia Minor. Forces of the Eastern Empire desperately tried to bar the invader, but at the Battle of Manzikert 1071, the Turks captured the Eastern Empire and scattered his army. Within a few years, Asia Minor, the chief source of Byzantine revenue and troops, was lost, and the emperor was writing to Western princes and to the Pope, seeking mercenaries to aid in the rescue of lost territories. In addition, tales of alleged Turkish mistreatment of Christian pilgrims circulated throughout Europe, and though there is evidence that these stories were propaganda, rumors themselves were sufficient to inflame the minds of those in the West. In 1095, after the Eastern Emperor Alexis I sent out an urgent appeal for help, Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade to regain the Holy Land, preaching at the Council of Clermont in southeastern France. The Pope urged Christians to take up the cross and strive for a cause that promised not merely spiritual rewards but material gain as well. For this land which you inhabit is too narrow for your large population, nor does it abound in wealth, and it furnishes scarcely food enough for its cultivators. Hence it is that you murder and devour one another. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, wrest the land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. As Urbain ended his impassioned appeal, a roar rose from the multitude. Deus vult, God wills it. So there, on the spot, Urbain declared that Deus vult would be the Crusader battle cry against a Muslim enemy. For 7 centuries, Christians have tried to forget the Crusades, but neither Jew nor Muslim will allow them to do so. In our liberated generation, it is easy to dismiss the whole bloody affair as insane religious bigotry, forgetting the context in which it occurred. But the Crusaders were human beings, so their motives, like our own, were mixed and often in conflict. The word crusade itself comes from taking the cross, after the example of Christ. Thus, on the way to the Holy Land, the Crusader wore the cross on his breast. On the journey home, he wore it on his back. The Crusaders were fully aware of the spiritual rewards Urbain promised them, including full forgiveness of their past sins, and most of them shared a profound personal reverence for the soil that Christ had trod. The intensity of this emotion was later caught by Shakespeare in words of that pugnacious English monarch Henry IV. We are impressed and engaged to fight, to chase those pagans to those holy fields, over whose acres walked those blessed feet, which 1400 years ago were nailed, for our advantage on the bitter cross. For Urban and the popes who followed him, the Crusades were a new type of war, a holy war. Augustine had laid down the principles of a just war. It was conducted by the state. Its purpose was the vindication of justice, meaning the defense of life and property, and its code called for respect for non-combatants, hostages, and prisoners. All these evaporated in the heat of the holy cause. Urbain appealed for crusaders in the name of the Church. The purpose of the Crusades morphed from the liberation of fellow Christians into the conquest of the infidels in the Holy Land. And this high calling excused somehow the total disregard for non-combatants and prisoners. The inception of the Crusades ignited horrible attacks against the Jews, and even fellow Christians were not exempt from rape and plunder. Incredible atrocities befell the Muslim foes. Crusaders sawed open dead bodies in search of gold, sometimes cooking and eating the flesh, a delicacy they found better than spiced peacock, as one chronicler chose to describe it. Key events of the Crusades. From the end of the 11th century to the end of the 13th, Christian Europe, led by the popes, launched 7 major crusades, as well as various small expeditions. The First Crusade was composed of feudal nobles from France, parts of Germany, and southern Italy, where the Norman or Viking invaders had settled. The armies proceeded overland to Constantinople, having expected the help of European mercenaries against the Seljuks. The Emperor Alexis Comnenus was taken aback when confronted by an unruly horde of what Pope Urban himself had called a 4-time robbers. The emperor hastily directed the Crusades out of Constantinople to fight the Turks. The First Crusade was the most successful of the 7. With not more than 5,000 knights and infantry, it overcame the resistance of the Turks, who were no longer united. Above all, it captured the holy city, Jerusalem. A contemporary account of the Christian entrance into Jerusalem reads, "Some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies, others shot them with arrows, so that they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses, but these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, where men rode in blood up to their knees in bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies." At nightfall, the Crusaders' hands were still bloody when they folded them in prayer and knelt at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, sobbing for access of joy. The First Crusade captured a long strip of territory along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and created a feudal Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. It survived until 1291, when its last remnant fell to the Muslims. When the kingdom of Jerusalem faced its first crisis, tottering on the brink of destruction in 1147, Bernard, the power mystic of Clairvaux, called for the Second Crusade. Despite Bernard's rhetoric and the presence of royalty, the crusade achieved nothing. After 2 years, it simply melted away. The original frenzy had clearly cooled, and the signs of corruption of the holy cause were apparent. The popes needed money to meet such obligations as providing legates for the new Christian lands in the East, so they turned spiritual benefit into money-making advantage. Profiles of Faith. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, began having mystical visions when she was 3 years old. They continued throughout her career as a Benedictine abbess in Germany, a position she held while also preaching and teaching, composing music, studying natural medicine and the healing value of various plants and herbs, and writing volumes of cosmology, philosophy, and theology. Her visionary theology was encouraged by Pope Eugene III, and she consulted with, and sometimes challenged, many great leaders of her day, including Bernard of Clairvaux and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. She is one of only 4 female doctors of the Church, meaning that she has been recognized for her notable contributions to theology and doctrine. In the Middle Ages, sins, to be forgiven, had to be confessed. Upon hearing a confession, the priest not only pronounced the penitent's guilt for sin forgiven, thanks to the merit of Christ, but also required a penalty or satisfaction, some act of penance. As a mark of the penitent's sincere repentance, if the penitent died before performing this penance, purgatory afforded him an opportunity in the life after death. Such penance, whether in this life or in purgatory, was called temporal punishment. For years the Church had claimed the power to remit part of this temporal punishment, but no complete remission had been granted until Urban II at Clermont offered total remission or indulgence for crusaders who headed for Jerusalem out of pure devotion. It was only a slight step farther to confer like benefits upon those who were unable to go on a crusade, but who contributed to the cause. The wealthy could virtually buy a substitute. Thus the possibilities for fundraising opened in all directions, including construction of a hospital here or a cathedral there. In 1187, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, brought fresh and vigorous leadership to the Muslims. When Jerusalem was retaken by the Muslims, Christians, with some reluctance, responded to the cry for the Third Crusade, 1189. Its leaders were three of the most famous medieval knights. Famous medieval kings: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Richard the Lion-Hearted of England, and Philip Augustus of France. Frederick drowned in Asia Minor, and after many quarrels with Richard, Philip returned home. Saladin and Richard remained the chief protagonists. To keep the Muslims united, Saladin proclaimed a jihad, or holy war, against the Christians, but he remained a patient statesman and chivalrous warrior. "Abstain from the shedding of blood," he once said, "for blood that is spilt never slumbers." His common-sense approach to a settlement was evident when he proposed that Richard should marry his sister and be given Palestine as a wedding present, a proposal that shocked the Europeans. Richard and Saladin finally agreed to a 3-year truce and free access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. Since Saladin would have granted this concession at any time, the truce scarcely compensated for the cost of such an expensive crusade. The Fourth Crusade revealed the harsh realities of papal aspirations in the East and the degradation of the crusading zeal. Upon ascending the papal throne in 1198, Innocent III threw himself into the effort of reviving the crusading spirit, but the few knights who answered his call were unable to meet the outrageous shipping charges demanded by the Venetians. To secure the costs of shipping, the Venetians persuaded the Crusaders to capture the Christian town of Zara on the Adriatic coast. The town had been a nuisance to Venetian vessels for years, so in 1202 the Crusaders sacked Zara. Innocent complained that Satan was behind the whole rapacious affair and proceeded to excommunicate all who participated. The Venetians, however, followed their advantage by pressuring the Crusaders to attack Constantinople itself. Torn by warring parties within, Constantinople fell to the Crusaders. After ravaging the city, the Crusaders set up the Latin Empire of Constantinople in 1204 and promptly forgot about the deliverance of the Holy Land. Upon hearing of the conquest, Innocent wrote in rage, "You have spared nothing that is sacred, neither age nor sex. You have given yourselves up to prostitution, to adultery, and to debauchery in the face of all the world." Never one to pass a political advantage, however, Innocent appointed an Archbishop of Constantinople to serve Roman interests. The Latin Empire in Constantinople lasted until 1261, but the ancient city never fully recovered. The conquest widened the schism between the Greek and the Latin churches and hastened the fall of the city in 1453 to the Turks. Other crusaders marched and meandered east during these years, but none of the holy efforts postponed the predictable, the return of the Holy Land to Muslim control. The era of crusades ended in 1291 when Acre, the last stronghold of the Christians in the land where Jesus walked, fell to those who denied his deity. The long-range results of 2 centuries of crusading zeal are not impressive. If the primary purposes of the Crusades were to win the Holy Land, to check the advance of Islam, and to heal the schism between the Eastern and Western churches, then the Crusades failed miserably. For a time, 4 kingdoms led by Jerusalem were established along the eastern Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land. And these the Crusades created three semi-monastic military orders: Templars, or Knights of the Temple, whose first headquarters were on the site of the old Temple of Jerusalem; the Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, who were founded originally to care for the sick and wounded; the Teutonic Knights, exclusively a German order, combining monasticism and militarism. These orders had as their aims the protection of all pilgrims and perpetual war against the Muslims. These men of the cross could put 500 armed knights into the field, and their great castles guarded the roads and passes against Muslim attacks. For 2 centuries, the Templars in white robes, decorated with a red cross, the Hospitallers in black robes and a white cross, and the Teutonic Knights in white robes and a black cross, were common sights in the Crusader states. Perhaps the most significant result was the added splendor the Crusades brought to the papacy. Not only did a Pope, Urban II, launch the First Crusade, but the popes throughout the period were the primary inspiration for fresh expeditions. They, not the emperors, strove to unite inspiration for fresh expeditions. They, not the emperors, strove to unite Christendom against Islam. Scratch that. The new military orders and the new bishops in the Holy Land and those in Constantinople for a time were under papal protection and service. The Holy War was the papacy reaching for universal sovereignty, one united church, west and east. But like the Gothic architects who built their cathedrals higher and higher until the towers cracked and then crashed to earth, the popes tried the impossible. Christian Europe had no need for Syria or Jerusalem. She took them in a fit of enthusiasm and had no power to retain them. When trade and towns turned rulers and people to new interests at home, the popes remained faithful to the old ideal, Christian control of the Holy Land. It was their constant preoccupation. Unfortunately, the popes never held 2 basic truths that we must never forget. Christianity's high satisfactions are not guaranteed by possession of special places, and the sword is never God's way to extend Christ's church. This fault assured the religious collapse of the whole structure.